So, The Woman Who Ran, what did you think?
What a mysterious and miraculous little movie. I was completely mesmerized by it. It's really simply done. The camera work throughout is generally static with a conversation on screen, and it sort of changes the focus of the action through simple pans and even quite a lot of zooms. And the zooms, especially to begin with, give it an almost amateurish feel that meant I wasn't entirely sure what to make of it. And then that first conversation, the main character is talking to her friend, and they start talking about vegetarianism, and they're talking a lot about wanting to be vegetarian while eating all this meat. And then the friend starts to talk about consciousness and the distinction between body and mind, and how our mind can sympathize with the consciousness of animals, but our bodies obey their own impulses. And so there's this strange kind of tension between what is being said and what is being done. And because of that, and because the setup is so simple and the dialogue is so conversational and apparently straightforward, when these strange kind of profundities start to emerge, it seems faintly transcendent, like the effect is far more than the sum of its parts. And so I start to really pay attention to the film, and then in the next shot there's a housemate just cutting an apple, and because I'm paying attention to it, it feels it feels fascinating. And then they start having a conversation about the chickens. The neighbor's rooster every morning comes out and starts pecking the necks of the hens and dominating them. And then the door goes, and the housemate answers the door, and there's this neighbor there, and he, just like the rooster, starts asserting himself and saying, complaining that they're feeding these cats. He calls them robber cats, and that, it bothers his wife and all the rest of it. But instead of sort of backing down, the housemate asserts herself too. So once again, there's this tension between the conversation they had about the hen dominating the rooster dominating the hen, and the way they behave in real life. Um, and this kind of tension means that I'm alert to the film's complexities in a way that made me so engaged with the film and constantly sort of wrong-footed by it, because I'm completely absorbed, and then what's happening is nothing very much. And then like halfway through, there's this almost Lynchian transition. It cuts to a mountain and then seems to shoot the mountain from the reverse, as though we've gone over this mountain. And the woman is suddenly in a completely new apartment with another woman. There's no real context or transition. You don't know how she got there, but it's just a different friend. And they start having a new conversation, and these echoes start to appear. There's lots of people appearing on CCTV footage, like strangely intimate CCTV footage in places that you wouldn't expect to see a CCTV camera. And there's later on there's another apple, and she keeps repeating this conversation, this story about her and her husband, that her husband never wants them to be apart. For 5 years they've never been apart. She says this 3 times to 3 different people, and of course we never meet him. So there are these kind of ambiguities and inconsistencies that, and I'm not sure what any of it means. And I don't think it's the kind of film that it really makes sense to ask what it means. It's kind of a mood piece, and then it's got a fantastic ending. She goes to see this movie, she comes out and talks to her friend about, again, apparently banal stuff, and then she wanders back into the film, and the film is still playing, and apparently this film she's watching is just a camera on the beach with the waves washing over the sand. And then the credits to the film we're watching, The Woman Who Ran, roll up over the film that she is watching within the film, and the effect feels miraculous. And it reminded me, the whole film, that ending particularly reminded me of a shot from, I think it's right at the end of Uncle Bun-mi Can Recall His Past Lives by Werisa Thekl. And the mother and son are sitting on the edge of a bed in a hotel, and they get up and leave the room. And as they get up, they leave a second version of themselves kind of superimposed, sitting on the bed. And as a sort of camera trick, it's incredibly simple. It's just a superimposition. And yet the effect is so much greater than the sum of its parts that it's kind of astonishing. And the film's economy throughout actually reminded me of Bresson. You know, I think it's a film of that kind of stature. It had that kind of impact on me. It's a lot lighter in tone and feeling than Bresson cinema, but at the same, it has a similar kind of economy of means that creates an effect so far beyond the sum of its parts that the whole just feels completely astonishing. I was completely mesmerized by the film, and incredibly brisk. It's like 76 minutes. It just disappears and washes over you. I thought it was fantastic. I really enjoyed it.
I had a different experience with this film. I found it really tedious. I couldn't believe how poor the acting was, you know, and I was open to the fact that this may be deliberate. And I immediately thought of Bresson because there's those stories of Bresson working with amateur actors, making them say the lines many, many times to get all of the acting out of them. And so I was immediately kind of open to the fact that this might be what I was watching. So I stayed patient with it, but I did find it really tedious. I found the conversations completely unengaging pretty much all the way through. I thought the conversations were kind of soulless. And now, obviously, this is a foreign language to us. And so I do wonder what, maybe I'm missing some tone, some inflections that actually, if I was listening to it as a native speaker, I would hear more than I was hearing, just hearing the language and reading the text. But on the other hand, I can think of many films in a foreign language where I have found the dialogue and the acting completely compelling, even though I don't understand the words. So I didn't feel it was that. So I always had that problem with the film. I felt so disengaged from it. It felt so inauthentic. And if it was trying to be minimalist, it didn't. I don't think minimalist means boring. I think it's possible to be minimalist and to be really engaging and really compelling. And this just didn't do it for me at all. That thing with the camera zoom, I just thought was really out of place. So, you know, as you say, the shots are so minimalist, the camera doesn't move, the scenes are so simple. And then you get this really clumsy but deliberate, as you say, amateurish zoom in that's like, you know, the way you would zoom on a home movie camera. And I fail to see what the point of that was, apart from it was very jarring because the film was so minimal in the way it was shot. And then this very jarring thing. And there was a bit of me that was kind of excited by it. I liked it as a feature in itself, but I just don't see how it fitted into the film, apart from the fact that maybe it wanted you to settle into the minimalist feel of it, and then it just wanted to kind of shock you out of it. So I thought when the music played, there were 2 or 3 times when quite sentimental music, but almost tinny, played, and it was just hard to. Again, I kind of thought maybe there's something really interesting about this, but it just wasn't working for me. And I was really glad that it was only 77 minutes, because I would have found it hard to sit and watch that for 2 hours. There were, as I watched it, there were a few things that did generate some interest, and I do agree with you on most of the things that you found interesting about it. Um, there was something to do with different floors. They were often referring to the people upstairs or the people in the basement or living in basements, and I immediately thought of Lynch as well. It's funny, we both thought of Lynch and Bresson watching this film. I thought of Lynch, and there's even a point which feels like an explicit Lynch reference when she pulls a curtain, like a velvety type curtain, and comes through it. So I don't know what the significance of that was, but when that started repeating itself about the people upstairs or downstairs, that that did catch my interest. I thought the gender politics of this film are really all over the place. I really don't know what to think. I'm not sure what it's saying about women and men, and I like the fact that it has an ambiguous thesis in this regard, but I think principally it's a film about women. That's obvious, isn't it? The women predominate in this film, and I do worry that it might be a little bit problematic in terms of what it's suggesting about women. I'm not really sure, but that feels interesting in terms of that massive ambiguity. There's a lot about the way the women are, the way men are treated in this, that when they do appear in the story. I really liked the repetition in the three different acts of her telling the story about never being away from her husband, and this sense of something really odd going on, because clearly she's away from her husband for quite a time and she just keeps telling the same story. And maybe she is running away, the woman who ran. And so that, I guess, started to give something more solid to the lack of authenticity in the whole thing, because that I started to feel a bit more patient with the kind of inauthentic acting. I mean, it's so interesting that you had a completely different view, because for me it was so cold, it was so unengaging the way the lines were delivered. But I think when we saw her in a way being so superficial and inauthentic and just having this same conversation multiple times, I did think this is potentially something interesting. And there were lots of other incidental, recurring things happening, like beeping doors. There were no keys in this film. Every door beeped, and and had keypads and CCTV, as you say. There was so much talking about food in this film. And I did wonder, actually, if the main character, there was one or two things she said, which, maybe she was obsessed with food. Maybe she even had an eating disorder, because there was so much about food. There was quite a lot about alcohol. Alcohol was mentioned a lot in the film as well. And there was a lot mentioned about creative people. It was forever talking about artists or poets or architects. And so I think that all those things did generate some interest for me as I went through the film, but none of them hooked me in sufficiently to actually enjoy it. And at the end of the film, I was really glad it had finished, and I thought I really did not enjoy that film. Now, this morning I went on a long walk, and I was kind of digesting it a little bit, and the ideas were percolating, and it suddenly started to feel like there was something more there. So the mystery of it that you describe definitely started having some impact on me. And I think it's a good example of a film that can, because I think I often have this with, or sometimes have this with art house films that may actually be quite boring to watch at the moment of watching, but that they give you something. They plant an idea, they plant an emotion, they plant an experience, which maybe doesn't germinate until later. There's two levels at which you watch a film. There's the immediate experience, and then there's the experience as the film sits with you and how you come to interpret it. And in the second way, I think I'm feeling today like I've got quite a lot from this film. It does feel intriguing. It feels really intriguing when you put those things together. So it's funny because I had a very different experience watching it than you, but pretty much I could agree with everything that you said was interesting about it and made it so successful for you. Today I can see that, and I almost feel like watching it again because I do think that that's something that great art generally, not just films, but great art does this. It's for me, great art does more than just give you an immediate effect. It plants something which maybe you think about at a later time, and something the poetry happens inside you at a later date than actually experiencing it. And so it does make me want to watch more of his films and see, just see what types of films this guy has made. I mean, we know nothing about this director, do we? So it'll be interesting. I do want to see some more of his films and see what themes. Yeah, I feel like I might understand this film better if I know what themes he's interested in. Um, I think it's so. I think in the end, my overall assessment is that this fell short of being fantastic, because I think it's possible to produce a film that does what this film did for me without it being boring. I think great art has something of an experience when you engage with it directly, and then this after effect as well. And it fell short because it didn't do that for me. I don't think a minimalist film has to be tedious and boring, which I did find this film. But today I feel like I really like it, and I would be ready to sit through it again, actually.
Really interesting to hear your comments. I got a few things to say. I I I think great art, really interesting art, is entertaining, or for me anyway, is entertaining not because what is shown on screen is really exciting, but because it is able to teach the viewer to encounter the artwork in such a way that whatever is shown becomes fascinating. And it's that idea that you're really interested in. Instead of recognizing things, you begin to experience them. And somehow this film did that for me very, very quickly. So as I said, when I was just watching someone peeling an apple, I was kind of mesmerized. And there is a certain type of filmmaking, and it does tend to be filmmaking that is fairly, I guess you'd call minimalist or quite austere, patient, slow cinema, that when that's done right, I'm just completely glued to the screen. We talked about Bellatar in another podcast, but I can watch his characters walking away from the camera for 4.5 minutes and just be completely mesmerized. And I felt that way with this one. I was completely hooked. I found the poetry of it extraordinary. And I think the zoom was the zoom, which draws such attention to itself, was the first time I started to pay attention, because it's so apparently out of place and amateurish. And I think, well, what's that about? What's he doing? And then, as you say, that the performances themselves have that kind of muted, almost model-like simplicity, which is really risky, because if you get that wrong, you just feel like you're watching wooden people say uninteresting things.
Yeah.
But I think the filmmaker, takes that risk for the same reason Bresson does. With this belief that if you can, as you say, wash out the performance, then what starts to emerge from these interactions is so much more interesting and organic than than the kind of artifice of well-crafted dialogue, which is a pleasure in itself in a different type of filmmaking. But I think that's what it's going for, and it's risky. And I can see how for some people it just would fall flat. For me, it just got me immediately. And as you were talking about the different flaws, a kind of reading of the film started to occur to me that you're right, they talk a lot about flaws. And then that moment before the transition, when she goes to the other friend's house and you don't know why she's there or how she got there, she's asleep and her friend wakes her up and she's obviously still half dreaming, and she starts saying, what's on the third floor? Why is the third floor locked? And I wonder then if this film, and there is that conversation early on about consciousness and freeing your consciousness so that it can sympathize with like non-humans, with animals. In fact, there's a lot of animals in the film. I wonder if these levels are layers of consciousness and about kind of transcendence almost. And so perhaps when she is, when the film within the film plays the credits to this film, maybe that marks a kind of transition beyond the self or something. I mean, this is an interpretation that's occurred to me as you were talking, but I think it's a film mysterious enough to invite those kinds of interpretations. And that would again really invoke Lynch, particularly Mulholland Drive. One of the most compelling interpretations of that movie I've read is that the first like hour and a half, 2 hours is a dream version of the last 15 minutes of the film. And so perhaps there's something of that going on here, that these conversations, seemingly banal, take on a kind of profundity, a dreamlike profundity as they're repeated and as things echo back and forth across the text. So it seems like we agree that there's an interesting kind of fecundity there in these ideas. I guess it just comes, the only difference between us was that I found that immediately compelling and mesmerizing, and I wasn't bored at all. Like Tara, I could have watched this for hours, and I even wrote "wow" a couple of times in my notes in a really kind of awestruck way. You know, I was completely blown away by it. And I would definitely go back to his, you know, watch the rest of his films. I think there's more on Mubi, aren't there? There are a few more of his. So yeah, cool movie.
Yeah, I think it's a very generous interpretation that I am going to watch it again. It's short enough that it's easy enough to do. I am going to watch it again to give it another chance and to come at it from a slightly different perspective now. But I think that possibly is a bit of over interpretation, the whole transcendence thing. But I can see how you can put that together. The one thing I do really agree with you on is, and as you were mentioning it again, I really had a sense of it, of the apple, the twice that a person sits there and peels an apple and then chops it into quite big pieces that, you know, they then eat. And I've only just realized it as you're talking about it, but there's something about that makes me want to get a very sharp knife, because I don't have a knife sharp enough to do peel the apple the way they did, to get a very sharp knife and to get some really good quality apples and to have that experience. So there was something really successful about phenomenologically of kind of giving me something of that experience, which I didn't completely recognize at the time, and just is really, so this really confirms the point about this film has planted a lot inside me that I'm only just realizing. And so there's something really quite amazing about that a film that is so minimalist and so simple and so devoid of anything that actually is really compelling, that draws you in, can have such a profound effect. Because I really want to have not just any apple, I want to have an apple peeled like that and like cut into chunks like that. And so that actually that alone is an incredible achievement, I think.
Yeah. I don't think, that interpretation that I was just sort of unspooling as we spoke there, I think there's something like that going on here. I think this filmmaker is too smart for that film to just be a bunch of empty conversations. There's something really profound there, and I think the filmmaker is a genuine artist, and there's real clarity of vision behind that film. I think that it's a film of real depth, I think.
I agree with you, actually. I think that's why on the Zoom thing, which I really find it hard to see how there's because the fact that it zooms in the way that it does isn't isn't doesn't really fit into that interpretation, does it? It doesn't feel like the zoom does anything to the to my understanding of what this film might be about. But on the other hand, I am coming to trust this filmmaker enough that I'm thinking it has to have some purpose. I agree that this is not just some random thing. That this is very deliberate. So the sentimental tinny music, which I can't see the point of at the moment, actually has a purpose. And I think you're possibly right, because there is that conversation about consciousness at the beginning, and her, is it with the cat or with the chicken, where she's kind of, or is she talking about a dog? She's talking about communicating with an animal's consciousness.
Cow.
And and so I think that does set it up for being about consciousness.
And I think the purpose of the zoom, I think, is to draw your attention to the filmmaking style. It's like it's the only concession the film affords itself. It's like saying everything else is going to be so subtle that you could quite easily miss these complexities. But because the zoom is so jarring and obvious, I'm paying attention to it. And so it was the only thing that sort of upset me a little bit, or enough to start really paying attention to what was going on, and then allow these kind of complexities to develop.
Yeah. So we'll definitely have to watch some of the other films, and maybe we can review some of them in future podcasts.
Yeah.
Cool. So what are we doing next?
So next we're going to watch First Cow, the new Kelly Reichardt film.
Great. Looking forward to it.